According to the official system requirements, the GTX 1060 is the minimum GPU to play Black Myth Wukong at, well, it says medium settings 1080p. It doesn't give a frame rate target, and things get even more complicated because the above specifications were tested with DLSS, FSR, or XeSS enabled at what setting, it doesn't say. So you know what, now that we have the benchmarking tool released on Steam a week ahead of the game actually launching, I have been benchmarking this game. So the benching has commenced. What was the result? Well, another thing I want to address, because I already did a video benchmarking this game, where I was looking at an RTX 4090, and a lot of people instantly saw that the frame rates were quite low at 4K native on some of the highest settings in the game, and were instantly commenting that the game is completely unoptimized. Now, I'm not saying this game isn't unoptimized, but I'm just saying that you shouldn't just say because a game runs poorly at maximum settings, even on expensive hardware, that the game is unoptimized. What's more important, in my opinion, is scalability. It's not how well do the maximum settings run, it's how much performance scalability is on offer, and does it still look reasonable with the performance scaling. So the first thing I'm actually looking at on the GTX 1060 here is we're going to be looking at, let's go ahead and play the benchmark run, but on the left-hand side of the screen, you're seeing the game at maximum 1080p settings. This game doesn't really have any just normal TAA. You pick, TSR, FSR, or any of your supported scalars and just set it to 100%. Now you're at native resolution. And we can see the game does run quite poorly on the 1060 at the maximum settings. But if you go down to low settings, the scaling on offer is also all the way down to 33% rendering resolution. Well, the game does look pretty awful on the right-hand side of the screen. It's a blurry mess because you're at 33% on each axis, so that's actually even less than 33% of the total pixels. The low settings also mean the textures here are not looking great. We've lost a ton of detail. That being said, the frame rate is over 6 times higher when we're down at the absolute minimum settings the game has on offer. So we are able to go from a 13 frame per second average at the cinematic settings at native 1080p resolution all the way up to 82 frames per second average at the low settings with the resolution slider all the way as low as it possibly goes using TSR as the upscaler. So again, that's over a 6 times performance increase from the maximum 1080p settings to the minimum 1080p output with much lower than a 1080p internal rendering resolution scaling. Now, does this mean the game's well optimized? Well, I mean, the right-hand side of the screen here does look like a blurry mess, and it's lost a ton of detail. A lot of things draw in very close to the screen. So I'm not going to say that it's running amazingly well. However, keep in mind that this is a GTX 1060. This is an old graphics card that wasn't a high-end graphics card even when it first released. And this is one of the most advanced Unreal Engine 5 big graphic showcase titles that we've seen coming out midway through 2024. So what are your expectations for a GTX 1060 in this game? So anyway, I guess what I'm showing here is there is a lot of scalability on offer, especially if you're willing to drop the rendering resolution and get kind of a blurry mess out of things, but that might not be what you want to go. I think this is pushing things a little bit too far. So let's go ahead and play around with some other possibilities, although I will show you the built-in benchmark screen right here. So what if we don't want to turn the rendering resolution down to a blurry mess? So here we're at 100% native 1080p resolution using the TSR setting as our upscaler choice, but again, running at 100% resolution. We're down from not using cinematic because we kind of already ruled out that cinematic ran in the teens. That was no good. So here we're seeing high settings on the left, medium settings in the middle, and low settings on the right. And I think, again, if you just look at the visual quality and you're not looking at the frame rate, I think we might agree that the low settings definitely stand out here as looking visually noticeably worse than the high and medium settings. Whereas while medium definitely looks worse than the high settings, the differences are a lot more subtle than what we're seeing between the medium settings and the low settings. So now if we then look at the performance numbers, we're seeing the high settings are running at 23 FPS average, the medium jumps to 28 FPS average, and while you might think of that as only a 5 frame per second difference, you really need to think of these things not in terms of a number of frames per second, but in terms of percentage increases. That's a much better way of thinking about how much performance are we gaining. And so from that perspective, we're seeing a 22% performance increase going from high to medium. It's still not a 30 FPS average though. So if we now go down to the low settings and leave it at 100% rendering resolution scale, that does push us over that 30 FPS average. We hit 31. And if you're looking at that as a scaling from the high settings all the way down to the low settings, we're getting a 35% performance boost. Now remember, if we're compared it to the actual max settings with the cinematic settings all the way down to low, there's actually a, I think a more than doubling of performance going from cinematic to low. So there is a lot of performance scaling on offer in this game before you touch the rendering resolution scaler. However, the GTX 1060 is needing to go all the way down to low settings just to hit that 30 FPS, and the minimum frame rates were even below 30 FPS. So I think that realistically, we're going to have to accept that if you actually want to enjoy this game on a GTX 1060, you will probably need to be dropping below a native 1080p rendering resolution. And since I think between the high, medium, and low settings, the medium settings seem to be a better compromise visually than the low settings, I'm going to compare high and medium settings with TSR's rendering resolution set to 67%. Now, why did I choose 67%? That corresponds to what would be called quality if you looked at something as like FSR or DLSS. FSR and DLSS call 67% of the native rendering resolution per axis, not total pixel count, but per axis, as the quality setting. So we're essentially looking at 720p internal rendering resolution and then upscaled to a 1080p output. And again, I'm using the TSR upscaler, which is Unreal Engine 5's own kind of name brand upscaler for Unreal Engine. Here we're seeing on the left that we do get 35 frames per second with the high settings at TSR 67%. So if you are just shooting for a 30 FPS frame rate cap, you could probably go TSR 67%, high settings, and then cap to 30 FPS and have a reasonable 30 FPS lock, at least if this built-in benchmark run corresponds to actual gameplay, which we have yet to find out because the actual game doesn't release for a week as of the time of filming here. The medium settings, though, are hitting 44 FPS average with the 1% lows down at 38. So this would be more appropriate, I think, if you were either playing at a variable refresh rate or wanted to try for like a 40 FPS cap. It might dip below that 40 FPS cap a little bit. You could touch the rendering resolution percentage a bit lower. It is a slider, so there's a lot of granularity there. And so I really think the medium settings, TSR quality, for kind of the mid-40s experience here is probably, I think, the way a lot of people might want to go for experiencing this game on the GTX 1060. I don't like upscaling at 1080p resolution, but you're using a GTX 1060 in 2024 on a big AAA Unreal Engine 5 release, so that at least looks pretty playable to me. But this game does also feature frame generation, including FSR. I think it must be 3.1 frame generation because you can use the frame generation from FSR on top of other upscalers. So, for example, we can use it with TSR or with DLSS, although the GTX 1060 doesn't support DLSS. We're using TSR here. And on the left-hand side of the screen, we're just looking at those settings that we kind of dialed in with the 67% medium settings, 44 FPS average. On the right-hand side of the screen, we're keeping those settings as the baseline, and then we're enabling frame generation on. And so do keep in mind that while there's a large boost to frame rate, it's 57% more frames on screen, going from 44 to 69, nice frames per second. That's a boost to the motion fluidity, but it's not going to be a boost to the responsiveness of the game, which is an important distinction with frame generation that I think does need to keep being mentioned, because it's not just increasing your performance. A lot of people use that word for it, and that's really not what it's doing. The game's not going to respond any faster, but you will get more motion fluidity on the screen. So some people might find that trade-off worthwhile. The responsiveness of frame generation will feel more like half of what the FPS number is actually showing. So this would feel more like about 35 frames per second of responsiveness, but look closer to 70 frames per second of motion fluidity, if that kind of makes sense. Anyway, because the 1% lows are also hitting 59, you could also theoretically use this as like a 60 FPS cap if you were not on a variable refresh rate display. Although frame generation from 30 to 60, again, for me doesn't feel real great. So I'm not sure I would use the frame generation here, but I did want to at least test it out because it is available. And, the 1060 isn't, I think, even officially, recommended for using FSR frame generation, but it does seem to be getting a healthy frame rate boost out of it, as long as you keep in mind the image quality and responsiveness trade-offs that you get from using frame generation compared to native rendering, if we want to call it that. Anyway, here's the overall benchmark screen that you can see here. And so the next thing I wanted to test out was, okay, I've been using the TSR upscaler, but right now what we're looking at is TSR upscaling on the left and FSR upscaling on the right. Now, I kind of naturally defaulted to choosing TSR without much thought, just because in most of the other Unreal Engine 5 games I've tested, I've preferred the image quality of TSR to FSR, especially at lower rendering resolutions. But I didn't want to just assume that would be the case here, so I figured it would also be a good idea to test out FSR. Now, I'm going to be honest here, I think, at least in this built-in benchmark scene, they're fairly similar. I'm not seeing dramatic differences in the image quality between the two. And I think some people may prefer one over the other. Maybe it's not completely clear-cut. However, I will also mention that the main thing that FSR upscaling struggles with isn't something this built-in benchmark run does a good job of showing, which is when a character moves quickly in front of you in a third-person action game like this is, a lot of times in motion, FSR breaks up worse than other upscalers do, like XeSS and TSR and DLSS. And this built-in benchmark run doesn't really give us an example of a character moving quickly in front of us on screen with disocclusion artifacting and things like that. So really, I guess what I'm trying to say is, while I did test these out to see if one stood out as dramatically better than the other, I don't think that the scene this benchmark run is giving us is great for choosing the image quality differences and highlighting the issues that FSR often has in this type of game. So we might have to wait till the game actually launches. What we can determine here, though, is that TSR is 2% faster when applied at these settings here. In other words, they perform about the same, so if you feel one looks better than the other, use the one that you feel looks better than the other. I think my edge is generally towards TSR, so I'm going to stick to TSR here. But if you preferred FSR, again, performance numbers look to be about the same, at least in this particular test. Now, what I'm looking at here is, okay, so we still weren't hitting 60 frames per second. Now, shooting for 60 frames per second on a GTX 1060 in an Unreal Engine 5 game in 2024 might be a bit of a stretch, but it's not impossible, as long as you're willing to let the rendering resolution drop pretty low. It'll drop low enough that for me, it might not be worth the trade-off. Things are looking quite pixelated here, especially when things are in motion or disoccluded. But what we're looking at here is an internal rendering resolution of 50% per axis. So in terms of FSR and DLSS's normal nomenclature, they would call this performance mode upscaling. So at 1080p, this is basically rendering at 540p internally, and then trying to reconstruct a 1080p-like output image. But as you can see here, there's just not a lot of pixels to work with, so there's definitely a lot of blur and pixelation to what we're seeing here. We're also looking at the difference between doing it at medium settings as the baseline versus low settings at the baseline, and there is a performance differential there of 18%. Low settings are giving us 65 frames per second, whereas medium settings are giving us 55. So if you were on a 60 hertz display that didn't offer variable refresh rate, and you were trying to lock to 60 FPS limit as often as possible, maybe getting that last bump in performance by going down to low settings could be worth it. However, if you're on a variable refresh rate display, or maybe could custom set your monitor to 50 hertz if it's not variable refresh rate and try to lock to 50, I do think the medium settings look a lot better than the low settings. Like if you look at the dirt pathway on the road and things like that, the medium settings still keep a lot of the detail on that road, whereas low settings, it just kind of looks very flat and brown with a massive loss to detail overall. So I really do think the medium settings and trying to hold to that instead of dropping down to the low settings would certainly be my preference image-wise. But again, going down to 50% rendering resolution scaling is already taking kind of a pretty big hit to the image quality anyway. But it is what it is, and the performance numbers are now either a little below 60 or a little above 60, depending on whether you go with the medium or the low settings overall. Now, if you want to absolutely abuse the image quality and get a complete blurred mess, you can boost the performance numbers a lot higher, and that's what we're looking at here. This game does allow the rendering resolution slider to go all the way down to 33% per axis. So in other words, 1/3 of the resolution per axis, which actually only gives you 1/9 of the total pixel count that the native resolution would. However, it's then feeding through the TSR upscaler to try to reconstruct a 1080p-like image. But you can see if you look at this character here, it's very blurry. It smears when there's motion. And again, this built-in benchmark doesn't even have a lot of motion. So I have a feeling that in combat and action and things like that, we'd probably see a lot more smearing. Once again, we're looking at the medium settings versus the low settings. And here the medium settings are able to hold 68 frames per second. Wish they could have got one more, but oh well. And the low settings are able to hit 82 frames per second. So now there's a 21% performance difference. But once again, I will say the medium settings are holding a lot more of that detail. Again, especially when you look at this pathway here, that kind of flat brown look on the low settings is quite a bit different than the more detailed and nuanced kind of pathway and things on it on the left-hand side of the screen. Again, we're already kind of destroying the image with the 33% internal rendering resolution, though I just did want to show, okay, how far can we push the frame rates? So anyway, you can get over 80 frames per second on the GTX 1060 in this game if you're wanting to play the game as responsively as possible and just don't care much about what it looks like. The medium settings retain a little more of the art look of the game, but still is going to be pretty smeared unless you're on maybe like a really, really small screen or something. I don't know. But we're hitting 68 frames per second there, so if you were trying to lock to a 60 FPS monitor, you should be able to do that. But again, the 33% per axis rendering resolution just really isn't a great experience. So anyway, last final thoughts. Let me pop out for that a little bit. One thing I'll mention is, okay, the game also does have an auto-recommended settings function. So I did also just play around with that. So when I clicked on apply recommended graphics settings, I just was curious what it would say. And what it ended up doing was medium settings, TSR 33%. So similar to what we did, except with FSR on. Sorry, not FSR, but TSR upscaler with frame generation on. The frame generation, I think, has to be FSR frame generation, even though it doesn't specify. I'm pretty sure it's using FSR 3.1 frame generation. And when it does this, it actually does end up having a very high overall frame rate. If we go to the ending title screen here, it's hitting 98 frames per second as an average frame rate. Again, that's achieved through frame generation, so it would feel closer to 50 FPS in terms of responsiveness. But again, it's default recommending a 33% rendering resolution. Also, I've noticed sometimes this report at the end sometimes like is adjusted slightly differently than what you actually set in the graphics menu. Like it set 33 and then now it's showing 32. So that's interesting. Sometimes when I set 67, this thing says I was at 66. So anyway, whatever. So overall, it looks like the game is in fact scalable, especially if you're willing to accept pretty low rendering resolutions. Again, you know, we can go from 13 all the way up to 82 if we're not using frame generation, going from kind of max settings all the way down to low with a really low internal rendering resolution, but you do kind of destroy the image quality along the way. My overall thoughts are playing at something like medium settings with either TSR or FSR around 67% to kind of keep you over that 40 FPS line is probably a more reasonable way to play the game on the GTX 1060. And if you just absolutely must keep the native 1080p resolution, it did look like if you're willing to go down to low settings, you are able to hold around 30 FPS in the benchmark on low settings at 100% rendering resolution. But again, that's kind of threading the needle pretty close there. So last thing we really need to find out is, does this built-in benchmark that they're giving us a week early actually correspond to combat gameplay performance, which it might, or it might not. This benchmark could be a worst case scenario or a best case scenario. We'll just kind of have to wait and find out. Let me know what you guys think in the comments section. Hope you guys found the video useful and or interesting. If you want to support all the benchmarking and news and everything I do here on the channel, consider hitting the join button down below to directly support the channel financially. As a thank you, you get little badges on your comments. They're easier for me to find. You get early access to certain videos, like I'm probably going to post this video up for members early because right now I have my other video, which again you could watch, that I've already done and posted, and I want to give it some time where I looked at all the different graphics settings at a lot of rendering resolutions, but focusing on an RTX 4090 and with a lot of ray tracing coverage. And this video focusing more on the GTX 1060 I think is also worth publishing, but want to give it some space in the algorithm. So again, early access to some videos and all that. It's possible I will also pop in and check out some of the other GPUs they recommended. I think the next one I'm interested in testing is the RTX 3060, because that's a very popular graphics card right now, and I think it would be interesting to see if it actually holds up with ray tracing, as they seem to be claiming it does. If that's worth it, is it, you know, what kind of performance does it get overall? So let me know if you guys are interested in the 3060 or 4060 or anything like that. Anyway, there's a week till the game comes out, so if you guys are still interested in videos benchmarking this game, I might keep doing them. We'll see how it goes. Anyway, I should probably quit rambling and just post the video, so I hope everybody has an excellent day.